Imagine a mind so brilliant, so consumed by the fire of mathematical genius that it would sacrifice everything, friendship, family bonds, even a father's love for his own son, all on the altar of intellectual supremacy. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Johann Bernoulli, a man whose legacy would reshape the very foundations of mathematics, yet whose personal life reads like a Greek tragedy written in equations and betrayal. Welcome to Numbers and Narratives by Blesswright, where we uncover the human stories behind the mathematical giants who changed our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most complex, controversial, and captivating figures in the history of mathematics. If you're fascinated by the intersection of genius and human frailty, if you want to understand how brilliance and darkness can coexist in a single soul, then you're in exactly the right place. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're about to embark on a journey through 3 centuries to meet a man who would stop at nothing to claim his place in the pantheon of mathematical immortality. This is the story of Johann Bernoulli. The year was 1667, and in the ancient city of Basel, Switzerland, a child entered the world who would one day hold the mathematical community in the palm of his hand. But Johann Bernoulli's arrival was not greeted with the fanfare one might expect for a future giant. He was born into a family of merchants and pharmacists, a world where numbers meant profits and losses, not the elegant dance of calculus and infinite series. His father, Nicolaus Bernoulli, had built a successful spice trading business, and he had clear expectations for his sons. They would follow sensible paths, become respectable businessmen, or perhaps, at best, physicians or lawyers. Mathematics, that was a gentleman's hobby, not a profession. Little did Nicolaus know that his son Johann would become one of the most formidable mathematical minds Europe had ever produced, and that the Bernoulli name would echo through the corridors of scientific history for generations to come. Young Johann grew up in a household that valued pragmatism over abstraction, commerce over contemplation. But inside this boy burned a different kind of fire. While his father dreamed of ledgers and trade routes, Johann's mind wandered to the mysteries of nature, to the hidden patterns that govern the physical world. He had an older brother, Jakob, who was 12 years his senior, and Jakob too felt the irresistible pull of mathematics despite their father's disapproval. The relationship between these two brothers would become one of the most famous, most productive, and most poisonous rivalries in the history of science. Initially, Johann obeyed his father's wishes. He enrolled at the University of Basel in 1683 to study medicine. For years, he dutifully attended lectures on anatomy and physiology, learning the arts of healing that his father deemed respectable. But medicine could not contain the wild, restless genius that stirred within him. In the evenings, away from the dissection tables and medical texts, Johann would steal away to study mathematics with his brother Jakob, who had by then established himself as a serious mathematician despite having also been pushed toward theology by their father. The two brothers would sit together, working through problems, exploring the new and revolutionary ideas that were sweeping across Europe like an intellectual wildfire. This was the age of the scientific revolution, a time when the old certainties were crumbling and new ways of understanding the universe were emerging. Isaac Newton in England and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in Germany had independently developed the calculus, a mathematical tool so powerful, so transformative, that it would become the language of the modern world. Calculus allowed mathematicians to understand change itself, to capture the infinite in finite equations, to describe the motion of planets and the flow of fluids with unprecedented precision. It was intoxicating, and the Bernoulli brothers were among the first on the continent to truly grasp its potential. Johann completed his medical degree in 1694, writing a dissertation on muscle contraction that applied mathematical principles to physiological problems. But his heart was never in medicine. By this time, he and Jakob had become deeply immersed in Leibniz's calculus, corresponding with the great man himself and working to extend and refine his methods. The brothers were brilliant, both of them, and together they made Basel a center of mathematical innovation. But brilliance, as history teaches us again and again, does not guarantee harmony. The seeds of discord were planted early. Johann was the younger brother, but he was also, by many accounts, the more naturally gifted mathematician. He had an intuitive grasp of the subject that seemed almost supernatural, an ability to see through problems to their essential core with startling clarity. Jakob was more methodical, more careful, perhaps more rigorous in his approach. Both methods had their strengths, but in the competitive world of 17th-century mathematics, where priority of discovery meant everything, these differences became fault lines that would eventually tear the brothers apart. In 1691, Johann made a journey that would change his life. He traveled to Paris, the intellectual capital of Europe, where he met the leading mathematicians and scientists of the day. It was there that he gave private lessons in calculus to a young French nobleman, the Marquis de L'Hopital. This relationship would prove both fortunate and controversial for Johann. L'Hopital was wealthy, well-connected, and genuinely interested in mathematics, though his talents were modest compared to Johann's genius. The two men struck a deal. Johann would share his discoveries with L'Hopital, and in return, L'Hopital would provide financial support. It seemed like a fair exchange, a patronage arrangement common in that era. But there was a problem, one that would haunt Johann for years. In 1696, L'Hopital published a textbook on calculus, the first such book ever written, titled Analyse des infiniment petits. It was a sensation, making L'Hopital famous throughout Europe as a master of the new mathematics. The book contained a rule for evaluating certain types of limits, a rule that became known as L'Hopital's rule, and is still taught to calculus students today. But here's the painful truth that Johann knew and could barely contain. Much of that book, including the famous rule, was actually Johann's work. The ideas, the methods, the insights, they were his, shared in those private lessons and in correspondence now published under another man's name. Johann had been paid for his knowledge, yes. But he had also been robbed of the glory that accompanied it. The frustration, the rage, the sense of injustice must have been almost unbearable. For a man as ambitious and proud as Johann Bernoulli, this was a wound that never fully healed. Johann tried to assert his priority during L'Hopital's lifetime, but delicacy and the social conventions of the era constrained him. L'Hopital was a nobleman, a patron, someone whose goodwill opened doors. Only after L'Hopital's death in 1704 did Johann begin to speak more openly about his contributions, producing correspondence and manuscripts to prove his claims. The mathematical community was divided. Some believed him, others thought he was simply jealous of a former student's success. The controversy lingered for decades, a bitter reminder that even the most abstract intellectual achievements are entangled with human emotions, with pride and recognition and the desperate need to be remembered. But the drama with L'Hopital was nothing compared to the catastrophe that was unfolding closer to home. Back in Basel, the relationship between Johann and his brother Jakob was deteriorating into open warfare. At first, their competition had been productive, spurring both men to greater achievements. They worked on similar problems, published in the same journals, engaged in what might have been a healthy rivalry between two brilliant minds. But as the years passed, the competition turned toxic. They began to criticize each other's work publicly, to dispute priority for discoveries, to exchange bitter accusations in the pages of scientific journals for all of Europe to see. The breaking point came with the Brachistochrone problem, one of the most famous mathematical challenges of the era. In June 1696, Johann posed a question to the mathematicians of Europe. What is the curve of fastest descent? If you have 2 points at different heights, what path should a bead take, sliding under gravity alone, to get from the higher point to the lower point in the shortest possible time? The answer is not a straight line, as intuition might suggest, but rather a curve called a cycloid. This problem required all the power of the new calculus to solve, and Johann issued his challenge like a duelist throwing down a gauntlet. Responses came from across Europe. Isaac Newton himself solved it, famously working through the night after receiving the problem and sending his anonymous solution to Johann. Leibniz solved it, and Jakob solved it too, publishing his own solution and method. But here's where the tragedy deepens. Johann had already solved the problem before posing it, and he published his solution alongside the others. The methods used by the two brothers were similar but not identical, and immediately they began to argue about who had the better approach, whose insight was deeper, who truly understood the problem's essence. What should have been a triumph, two brothers from Basel standing among the elite mathematicians of Europe, became instead another battlefield in their endless war. The arguments grew more personal, more vicious. Jakob, as the elder and more established brother, held the professorship of mathematics at the University of Basel. Johann, still seeking to make his mark, took a position as a professor of mathematics at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands in 1695. The physical distance did nothing to cool their animosity. If anything, it made things worse, as their disputes now played out entirely in published papers and letters, with no opportunity for face-to-face reconciliation. They accused each other of errors, of stealing ideas, of mathematical incompetence. Their correspondence, once filled with collaborative excitement, became a documentary record of fraternal hatred. Imagine the pain of this situation. These were not distant acquaintances or professional rivals who had never been close. These were brothers who had studied together, who had learned the calculus together, who had supported each other in defying their father's wishes to pursue mathematics. They had shared the excitement of discovery, the joy of solving problems that no one else in the world could solve, and now they could barely stand to read each other's names in print. Their mother must have been heartbroken. Their father, who had never wanted them to become mathematicians in the first place, might have felt a grim vindication. The cost of genius, it seemed, was measured not just in sleepless nights and intense concentration, but in broken relationships and poisoned family bonds. In 1705, Jacob Bernoulli died. He was only 50 years old, but he left behind a legacy of profound mathematical achievements, including pioneering work in probability theory that would influence the field for centuries. His final work, the Ars Conjectandi, was published posthumously and remains a cornerstone of probability theory. One might think that Jacob's death would have brought Johann some peace, perhaps even some regret for the years of conflict. Instead, it brought something else: opportunity. With Jacob gone, the prestigious chair of mathematics at the University of Basel was vacant. Johann wanted it desperately. Basel was home, the city of his birth, the place where the Bernoulli name meant something, and now, finally, he could return in triumph, taking the position that had always been his brother's. Johann got the position. He returned to Basel in 1705 and would hold that chair for the next 43 years until his death. He was now the dominant mathematical figure in the city, the man who would shape the next generation of mathematicians. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, making contributions to almost every area of mathematics and physics that existed at the time. He worked on differential equations, on the calculus of variations, on mechanics and optics. He corresponded with the greatest minds of the age, debating, arguing, always pushing for his ideas to be recognized, his priority to be acknowledged, his genius to be properly appreciated. But the pattern of conflict that had defined his relationship with Jacob did not end with his brother's death. Like some terrible curse, it repeated itself with even more devastating consequences in the next generation. Johann had 3 sons who survived to adulthood: Nikolaus, Daniel, and Johann Jr. He encouraged them in mathematics, how could he not? He was one of the greatest mathematicians in Europe, and he wanted his sons to follow in his footsteps, to extend the Bernoulli dynasty, to ensure that the family name would be linked with mathematical genius for generations to come. His middle son, Daniel, showed extraordinary promise. Born in 1700, Daniel Bernoulli grew up in a household where mathematical discussions were as common as conversations about the weather. Johann personally tutored his son, sharing with him the secrets of calculus, the techniques of problem-solving, the insights he had gained from decades of work. Daniel absorbed it all like a sponge, and soon he was making his own contributions. He was brilliant, perhaps even more brilliant than his father had been at the same age. He worked on fluid dynamics, on probability, on the kinetic theory of gases. His book, Hydrodynamica, published in 1738, laid the foundations for entire fields of physics and engineering. Father and son should have been allies, collaborators, a mathematical team that combined the elder's experience with the younger's fresh perspective and energy. But Johann Bernoulli could not bear to be outshone, not even by his own son. As Daniel's fame grew, as the younger Bernoulli began to receive honors and recognition from scientific academies across Europe, Johann felt not pride but jealousy. The same jealousy that had poisoned his relationship with Jacob now turned its corrosive power on his own child. The breaking point came in 1734, when both Johann and Daniel submitted entries to the annual prize competition of the Paris Academy of Sciences. The topic was the orbits of planets, a subject requiring deep knowledge of both mathematics and physics. Both men submitted excellent work, and then came the announcement. The prize was to be shared jointly between Johann Bernoulli and his son Daniel Bernoulli. It was an honor, recognition of the extraordinary talent in a single family. Most fathers would have been overjoyed. Johann was furious. To share a prize with his son felt like an insult, an implication that they were equals. But they were not equals in Johann's mind. He was the master, the teacher, the established genius. Daniel was supposed to be the student, the follower, the one who carried forward his father's work, not the one who competed with him for glory. Johann's rage was so intense that he did something almost unthinkable. He banished Daniel from his house. His own son, his brilliant, accomplished son, was no longer welcome in his father's home. The crime, being too successful, too talented, too much of a rival. But Johann's vindictiveness didn't stop there. In 1739, a year after Daniel published his masterpiece, Hydrodynamica, Johann published his own work on fluids, which he titled Hydraulica. He claimed that it was based on work he had done years earlier before Daniel's book, and he deliberately backdated his manuscript to 1732 to establish priority. It was a lie, or at best a gross exaggeration, and everyone in the mathematical community knew it. Johann Bernoulli, one of the greatest mathematicians of his age, was so consumed by jealousy that he tried to steal credit from his own son. The man who had been wounded by El Hospital taking credit for his work, who had fought bitterly with his brother over questions of priority, was now doing the same thing to Daniel. The tragedy of this situation is almost unbearable to contemplate. Daniel had lost not just his father's love but his father's respect and support. The house where he had grown up, where he had learned mathematics at his father's knee, was now closed to him. And Johann, for his part, had poisoned yet another relationship with his inability to share glory, his desperate need to be recognized as the supreme genius, the unrivaled master. The cost of his pride was his own son's love and companionship. Despite all this personal turmoil, Johann's contributions to mathematics were immense and undeniable. He was a master of calculus in all its forms, and he extended its reach into new territories. He made fundamental contributions to what we now call the calculus of variations, solving problems about finding curves and surfaces that optimize certain quantities. His work on the catenary, the curve formed by a hanging chain, was groundbreaking. He studied exponential growth and developed techniques for solving differential equations that are still taught today. His correspondence with Leibniz helped to refine and extend the foundations of calculus itself, and he defended Leibniz's notation and methods against Newton's supporters in the bitter priority dispute between those two giants. But perhaps Johann's greatest contribution to mathematics came not from his own research but from his teaching. Because for all his faults, for all his jealousy and pride and vindictiveness, Johann Bernoulli was an extraordinary teacher. He had a gift for explanation, an ability to make difficult concepts clear, to guide students through complex problems with patience and insight. His lectures at Basel attracted students from across Europe, young men who wanted to learn from one of the acknowledged masters of the age. And in 1727, a young man arrived in Basel who would change the course of mathematical history. His name was Leonhard Euler. He came from a modest background, the son of a pastor, but he had already shown remarkable talent in mathematics. Euler enrolled at the University of Basel at the age of 13 and quickly came to the attention of Johann Bernoulli. The old mathematician, now 60 years old, recognized immediately that this boy was special. Euler had the same intuitive grasp of mathematics that Johann himself possessed, the same ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. Johann took Euler under his wing, giving him private lessons, assigning him problems, challenging him to push his abilities to their limits. It was perhaps the teaching relationship that should have existed between Johann and his son Daniel. But here, with a student who was not a rival for the family name, Johann could be generous with his knowledge. He shared his insights freely, encouraged Euler's independence, and gave the young man the confidence to tackle the most difficult problems in mathematics. Euler would go on to become, by almost any measure, the most prolific mathematician in history. His collected works fill more than 70 volumes. He made fundamental contributions to almost every area of mathematics that existed in the 18th century, and invented several new fields himself. He worked on number theory and graph theory and topology and complex analysis and mechanics and astronomy and optics and acoustics and engineering. He was a titan, a once-in-a-millennium genius, and he always acknowledged his debt to Johann Bernoulli. In his letters and publications, Euler referred to Johann as his teacher, his mentor, the man who had opened the doors of mathematical discovery for him. This was Johann's redemption, his lasting gift to mathematics. He could not share glory with his brother or his son, but he could nurture the greatest mathematical mind of the age and send him forth to transform the world. Through Euler, Johann's influence would extend far beyond his own lifetime and his own work. The techniques Johann taught, the problems Johann posed, the insights Johann shared, all of these lived on and multiplied in Euler's staggering output. The Bernoulli family's mathematical legacy, which had begun with Jakob and Johann, reached its fullest flowering in this student who was not a Bernoulli by blood but was certainly a Bernoulli by intellectual inheritance. Johann lived to a remarkable age for his time. He was active and productive well into his 70s, still publishing, still corresponding with mathematicians across Europe, still defending his priority for discoveries made decades earlier. He outlived his brother by 43 years, his rival El Hospital by 44 years. He saw his son Daniel achieve fame and recognition despite their estrangement. He watched as Euler became the most celebrated mathematician in Europe. The young man who had defied his father to study mathematics, who had battled his brother for recognition, who had sacrificed family relationships on the altar of fame, finally had everything he had always wanted. He was acknowledged as one of the greatest mathematicians of his age. His work was known throughout Europe. His name was secure in the history of science. But at what cost? In his final years, did Johann ever reflect on the relationships he had destroyed? Did he ever regret the bitterness with Jakob, the cruelty toward Daniel, the decades of feuding and fighting? We don't know. His correspondence from those final years is mostly about mathematics, about defending his claims, about asserting his priority. The personal reflections, if they existed, have not survived. Perhaps he never regretted anything. Perhaps he believed that genius justified everything, that the pursuit of mathematical truth was worth any personal sacrifice, any broken relationship, any amount of human pain. Johann Bernoulli died on the 1st of January, 1748, in the same city where he had been born 80 years earlier. He was buried in Basel, and the mathematical world mourned the loss of one of its giants. Eulogies were published, testimonials to his genius and his contributions. Euler himself wrote movingly about his teacher, about the debt that all mathematicians owed to the Bernoulli family. The University of Basel held memorial services. Johann's passing marked the end of an era, the first generation of mathematicians who had truly mastered the calculus and used it to unlock the secrets of the natural world. But what are we to make of this man, this genius who was also a monster of pride and jealousy? History has not been entirely kind to Johann Bernoulli's reputation. His mathematical achievements are undeniable. They are taught in universities, used by engineers and physicists, embedded in the very fabric of modern science. But his character, his behavior toward his brother and his son, these cast a long shadow over his legacy. We cannot separate the mathematics from the man, cannot fully appreciate the Bernoulli contributions without understanding the Bernoulli conflicts. Perhaps there is something about genius that makes such conflicts inevitable. Perhaps the same intense focus, the same driving ambition, the same refusal to accept limits that makes someone a great mathematician also makes them terrible at human relationships. Or perhaps this is too easy, too much of an excuse. Perhaps Johann Bernoulli was simply a man with great gifts and great flaws, someone who achieved immortality through his work while destroying the relationships that should have brought him happiness in life. The story of Johann Bernoulli forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of genius and the price of achievement. We celebrate the Bernoullis, we name theorems and principles after them, we teach their methods to students centuries after their deaths. But we should also remember the human cost of their achievements, the relationships sacrificed, the love turned to hatred, the father who could not bear to see his son succeed. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Johann Bernoulli is that his work lives on, studied and used by millions who have never heard his name. The calculus he helped develop is the language of physics and engineering, the tool that allows us to design bridges and predict planetary orbits and understand the flow of air over an airplane wing. The techniques he pioneered are embedded in every scientific calculator, every computer program that simulates physical systems, every mathematical model that helps us understand our world. He wanted to be remembered, wanted his priority acknowledged, wanted glory and fame and recognition. And he got it, though perhaps not in the way he imagined. He is remembered not as a perfect hero but as a flawed genius, a man who reached the heights of intellectual achievement while stumbling through the valleys of human relationship. And we remember Leonhard Euler, his greatest student, who took everything Johann taught him and built upon it a mathematical edifice so vast and so beautiful that it transformed human knowledge itself. Through Euler, the Bernoulli legacy achieved its ultimate expression, reaching heights that Johann himself never could. It is a strange form of immortality, to live on through the work of a student who surpassed you in every way. But perhaps that is the truest form of teaching, the deepest form of influence, not to be remembered for your own achievements alone, but to have shaped a mind that would reshape the world. The tragedy of Johann Bernoulli is that he had so much, genius, achievement, a place in history, but it was never enough. He could have been happy, could have enjoyed collaborative relationships with his brother and his son, could have taken pride in Euler's achievements as a teacher takes pride in a successful student. Instead, he spent his life fighting, defending, asserting, demanding recognition that no amount of acclaim could satisfy. He won every battle for priority, claimed every discovery, published correction after correction of his rival's work. But in the end, what did those victories mean? His brother was dead, his relationship with Jakob poisoned forever. His son was estranged, their relationship never repaired. The recognition he craved came at the cost of the love he needed. This is the story we must tell about Johann Bernoulli, the full story, not a sanitized version that celebrates only the genius and ignores the man. Because the truth is more powerful, more instructive, more human than any simplified narrative could be. Johann Bernoulli was brilliant and petty, generous and jealous, a teacher who could inspire the greatest mathematical mind of the age and a father who could banish his own son. He was, in short, human, gloriously, terribly, completely human with all the contradiction and complexity that implies. When we study the Brachistochrone curve today, when we use Bernoulli's principle in fluid dynamics, when we work through differential equations using methods Johann pioneered, we're touching the work of a man who lived 300 years ago, who fought and loved and suffered and achieved and failed. The mathematics is pure, abstract, eternal. But it was created by someone who was none of those things, someone who was mortal and flawed and driven by emotions that sometimes elevated him and sometimes brought him low. And so ends the story of Johann Bernoulli, a man who changed mathematics forever while struggling to understand himself. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about genius and its costs, then please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Numbers and Narratives by Blesswright for more stories that dig deep into the lives of the mathematical giants who shaped our world. Leave a comment below telling me what you think. Was Johann Bernoulli a tragic hero or simply a cautionary tale? Did his achievements justify his behavior, or should we judge him more harshly for the relationships he destroyed? I read every comment, and your thoughts matter to this community. Remember, behind every equation, behind every theorem, behind every mathematical principle, there is a human story waiting to be told. And here at Numbers and Narratives, we tell those stories with all their drama, all their emotion, all their complicated truth. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chapter in the grand narrative of mathematics and the remarkable, flawed, brilliant people who created it.